مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يتمحور العام الأخير للرئيس عدة حول تكوين طريقة، وذلك باتخاذه إجراءات تحدد كيف تبقى ذكراه خاضرة في الأذهان. يحاول الرؤساء أحيانا التفاوض حول اتفاقيات للسلام أو إنهاء دور أمريكا في حرب خارجية، وأحيانا أخرى يسعى الرؤساء إلى تحقيق نجاح سياسي داخلي كبير. سلك الرئيس أوباما مسارا جديدا نحو طريقته، فخلال لقاء صريح مع الصحفي مرموق أوضح أوباما كيف ينبغي أن ينظر المؤرخون والزعماء السياسيون في اعتقاده إلى سياساته الخارجية. إنها سياسة من الواقعية والقبح، سياسة لا يعود فيها الشرق الأوسط جزءا مهما من العالم. إنها سياسة يتمس فيها الحد الفاصل بين الخلفاء والخصوم، وتسمى مبدأ أوباما. ما معنى مبدأ أوباما حقا؟ هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنناقش مبدأ أوباما مع لجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We're sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts discussing the Obama Doctrine. In a remarkable article, journalist Jeffrey Goldberg had outstanding and unprecedented access to the president and his senior advisors and produced deep insight into what the president is thinking about his role in the world. And it came up with the Obama Doctrine. So, gentlemen, in one sentence, what is the Obama Doctrine? Dennis.
Well, most doctrines can't be reduced to a slogan, but I would say the essence of the doctrine is define threats to American national security interests very narrowly, so that force is only used in the most limited sets of circumstances, avoid getting consumed in the entanglements of a very messy Middle East, and pivot towards those parts of the world where you think things are more dynamic and American interests can be served more generally that way.
Okay. One.
Maybe taking a step back, the Obama Doctrine could be defined as the restraint of American power, but American power in the service of long-term norms and principles that ultimately meet U.S. interests. And so it's a constrained perception of American power that has all sorts of limitations, but has in mind a very long-term goal of shaping norms and principles that ultimately do advance American interests.
Okay, now Dennis briefly mentioned and referenced the Middle East. This show is, of course, beaming out to the Middle East. Where does the Middle East fit in the president's worldview?
The Middle East in some ways is the incubator of the Obama Doctrine, but also the bedeviling geography of the doctrine. That is to say, the president very much wanted to remove American power and attention from the region, thinking that the U.S. had been consumed disproportionately with the problems of the Middle East, thinking that the U.S. could actually solve the problems of the Middle East, and that as a result we've meddled too much, that we've been overly aggressive, that we had the Iraq War. And so the Obama administration had thought that disentangling from the region, pivoting toward Asia, pivoting toward other concerns internationally was the way forward. The challenge with that, of course, is that many of our central crises and problems, not to mention our allies and adversaries, lie in the Middle East. And so in the Middle East you have a bit of the conflict and juxtaposition within the Obama Doctrine itself, a doctrine that doesn't want America to be entangled in this region, doesn't want to overuse power, but suddenly has to contend with all of the challenges and crises like Syria, like the rise of the Islamic State, that are certainly threats and of concern to the country.
Dennis, in a summary toward the end of the article, the journalist involved, I think channeling the president, actually said, the Middle East doesn't matter. Is that a novel idea in American foreign policy? What did the president really mean?
Well, certainly it would be a major departure, because every preceding administration, you could argue, maybe has been more involved or concerned about the Middle East than perhaps it should have been. That is a debatable proposition, but no preceding administration ever would have said, no president ever would have said, the Middle East doesn't matter. What I think President Obama would imply by this would not be so much that it's not that it's something that doesn't affect us, but he doesn't want us to be so preoccupied with it that we get consumed by what he sees are its messy, tribal, sectarian, his word, nihilistic conflicts, to the point that we can't be engaged with other parts of the world where the potential to advance, in a sense, civilization and progress and economic well-being exists in a way that he doesn't see is the case in the Middle East.
Now, Juan said a moment ago, traditional allies, we'll get to adversaries in a minute, traditional allies didn't fare very well in the president's description of the world. Can you tell us, our viewers, a little bit more about this?
Well, by the way, I think the president, you know, he in this case, he wasn't focused only on the Middle East per se. I mean, if obviously Saudi Arabia was told that they should, in a sense, share the Middle East with Iran. The British were, and the British and French were accused of, in a sense, being the ones who really dropped the ball when it came to Libya. What you got was a sense that the president feels that there, in his words, are too many free riders.
Can you explain the concept, both of you gentlemen, help explain the concept of a free rider to our audience? It doesn't easily translate well into Arabic.
I think the way to describe this is, again, to put it in an American context. It is not new for American presidents to want to share the burden of responsibility when it comes to dealing with conflicts. Frequently you've seen division of labor, share the burden. These are concepts that have been embedded in American foreign policy, particularly when it comes to alliance management. I think when the president refers to free riders, he means we carry the load, we do the bulk of the fighting, and we do the bulk of the spending in dealing with conflicts that affect the interests of others, not just us. Now, some would say, all right, that goes with being really the world's greatest power. You can use your power to get others to play a role and make commitments and invest as well. I think what the president was reflecting was a kind of frustration that there's been such an expenditure of American blood and treasure on conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, and others, in a sense, were the beneficiaries of what we were doing, but they didn't make the same kind of contribution that they should have.
And how do you think allies respond when they hear that the president is referring to them quite specifically as free riders?
Well, I don't think they like it. Obviously, the British and the French would say, look, we've contributed mightily to efforts, whether it be in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Libya. And so there is a degree of diplomatic offense to that kind of a statement. But Dennis is right that it does fulfill a broader sense in the United States and in the American context of the U.S. having to be the world's policeman, and President Obama very much wanting to recast that role and the perception of American power. And something that is fundamental to the presidency, and it's articulated in this interview and all the commentary that's come from it, is the fact that the president very much wanted and considers that American policy has to shift from constantly reacting to every conflict, constantly being first in and last out. And I think part of his doctrine, part of his thinking has been there needs to be not only a sharing of the burden, but in many cases the U.S. shouldn't even be involved to begin with. And I think Syria is an example of that. And the players in the region that have an interest actually have to resolve this unto themselves. And I think our allies have had to adjust to that kind of a role. The fact that the U.S. isn't going to be necessarily the driver or the quarterback of an effort, that the U.S. has sat back, and that has forced our allies to think differently, not only about their role, but about their relationship with the United States. And that's something very different, and I think this article helps articulate that in a way that we hadn't seen crystallized to date.
Mm-hmm. Did any of our traditional allies come off well in the president's sort of discourse?
Not in my reading of it. I mean, it really was, in some ways, what was more surprising about it than anything else is some of these kinds of observations you might have expected from the president after he had left office.
Well, I was going to ask you about this, jumping ahead a bit.
Yeah.
Why now? We got 10 months left, lots of things that he can do, lots of needs of allies to participate and contribute. Why is now the moment to slap him?
Well, I do think that's, one can raise the question, was this the best time to be saying these kinds of things when there's still a lot of business to be done in the remaining 11 months of the administration.
And perhaps new crises to have to deal with.
Right, and this is not exactly the best way to ensure that others who might play a role with you or that you might want to play a role, particularly if there are crises that even if the president doesn't want to be involved and makes the judgment that he can't avoid being involved in, that moment is when he's going to want to be able to call upon others, and it's going to be more difficult to do that given, I think, these observations. You asked me why the timing now. I think part of it is a genuine kind of feeling on the part of President Obama that he's been overly criticized, that his critics don't really get what's going on in the world, that he understands better the new dynamics internationally than his critics do. To quote him, the old playbook is not the right playbook, and maybe part of his role is to begin to reframe how we should be approaching foreign policy in a way that triggers more discussion on this.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk to Juan about this timing question, and we're going to focus intently on the issue of Syria, which the president uses as a lens through which to address the Washington establishment and why he's right and they're wrong. In just a moment. Again, my panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. His experience as the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing is the subject of his excellent book, Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. Sitting to his right is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, as well as service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. So Juan, let's pick up with you. First on the question of timing. Any special insight as to why now?
Well, I think there are three factors, and Dennis pointed out probably the most important one, which is the president thinks he has a long-term vision of where the world is going and where American power fits in that. And I think he wants to set the narrative for what that looks like, given a lot of the short-term crises that we're debating currently. And I think that's a big part of it. Secondly, I think he's looking at the end of his term and realizes that he's going to be handing the next president a very difficult international environment. And in some ways, he could be criticized the way that he criticized the Bush administration of handing the new team a series of problems and crises that are left unresolved. And so the president, I think, wants to account for that. And the third is, I think the president's a political animal. We're in the middle of a presidential debate where his policies are being debated every day in the press. And I think the president has demonstrated a great willingness to be a part of that debate. And I think this is part of that. He's shaping how even the presidential debate will will tackle and account for his foreign policy. So I think those are three reasons where the president in some ways couldn't help himself, because he does want to set the narrative.
I'm going to come back to the presidential election in just a moment, but I did want to ask you about this, ask both of you about the Syria red line episode, because it figures so prominently in the Obama doctrine, where the president not only defends his decision not to act militarily against Syria, but describes it as one of the greatest acts of moral courage of his administration to withstand the Washington consensus on the need to act and save credibility and act to respond to this outrage against innocent civilians. How did you react when you read that?
Not well. And that Washington consensus, by the way, clearly included his own Secretary of State, who the day before had given, in the words of the article, fairly described a Churchillian kind of statement about the consequences of what Assad had done with his chemical weapons attack, and what we therefore needed to do in light of it. And not well, because I think that the president still could have defended his decision, but not in a way that he did. Had he, for example, said, it was a very tough call. You know, I understood that if I didn't follow through, if I didn't carry out an attack at that point, it would raise questions about the validity and the weight and the credibility of America's word. And I know the consequences of that. For the future, I know what it means in terms of dealing with allies and others and how they perceive reality and the threats and whether they can count on the United States or not. But I made a judgment call based on what I felt would be the consequences of acting at that point and not having an effective use of force. So I made a call. I understood it was a difficult one, but I made it. But he didn't do that. Instead, he wanted to say this was a great decision. This was the right decision. It was one he's more proud of than almost any other decision he's made, because he felt he took on the playbook, and he challenged even the notion that credibility is a kind of legitimate concept for the use of force. And here it left me feeling very uneasy, because I think if others question America's word, then it becomes very hard to get them to work with us when we need them to work with us. It gets very hard for others to take risks that may be very difficult for them to take without them knowing that they can count on the United States. And if you want to shape a world that is in fact more stable and more hopeful and more likely to progress, America's credibility becomes very important in that context.
Mm-hmm. Juan?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, again, I'd listen to Dennis all day if I could, but I think that reflection on that episode in many ways reflects the fundamental flaws with whatever we call his doctrine. One is the fact that American credibility, not just in the region, but globally, was impacted by that decision. The president didn't do what he said he was going to do, didn't do what the Secretary said, the State said we were going to do. And so that, first and foremost, was a diminishment of American power and credibility. And that has long-term, broad implications, including in Asia, where the president cares. And so it's a reflection of his inability to recognize that that actually has global and long-term impact. A second dimension of this is perhaps a lack of perception of what American power really is. And I think one of the problems and challenges for the Obama administration is they have so often created this binary dichotomy between American power being simply brute use of massive military force or diplomacy or nothing, and a lack of recognition that there is a continuum of power that has to be at play constantly in order to influence and shape environments. And this kind of decision actually plays into the ability to use other forms of influence and power that has nothing to do with military power. So I think it's an absence of that recognition. And finally, a bit from a sort of a legal standpoint, the president has been committed to the establishment and reinforcement of international norms and principles. It's in some ways fundamental to the doctrine, as I said at the start. What we did in not reacting and not imposing some consequences for the violation of such a fundamental norm was to actually allow the norms to be withered away. And I think this is a challenge for the Obama administration as well, which is you cannot be for international norms and principles if you're not also for the enforcement and defense and the shaping of those principles. And that, at the end of the day, is a fundamental flaw, not only in this episode, but I think with the Obama foreign policy.
All right, so that said, now let's go back to the question you put on the table a moment ago. This is now out there at a moment of great political activity. How does this affect the campaign? Secretary of State, former Secretary Clinton, reads this. Does she embrace it the way she has embraced the president on the campaign trail? Dennis?
You know, I think she'll be very careful how she talks about foreign policy. I think in a lot of ways she will continue to create a kind of bifurcation, meaning on domestic policy she's going to be the kind of standard bearer of continuing what she agrees with in the domestic policy of the Obama administration. I think in foreign policy she won't criticize the president, she'll simply emphasize other issues.
And there you have it, the first reading on the Obama doctrine. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Look forward to having you back again in the future. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول نظرة الرئيس أوباما إلى دور أمريكا في العالم اليوم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.